When you watch Football Manager videos on YouTube, usually you only see this part. It's been like this for years, actually. Most creators will focus on the in-match experience. After all, that's where the action is, right? If they make a 20-minute video with nothing but this, would you even watch? And so for some of you, it might be a little bit confusing to see all the controversy on the internet around Football Manager 26, particularly around the user interface. I mean, after all, if you're only watching what people are uploading on YouTube, you usually don't see much of that interface. I mean, the in-match graphics do look better in FM26, right? Well, the thing is that the problem that you might not understand is that most of your time in Football Manager is going to be spent in the user interface, not in the matches themselves. And that means that Sports Interactive really needed to get that user interface right. You see, graphics like this aren't really the thing that makes Football Manager so habit-forming. Instead, it's searching for Wonder Kids on screens like this, or spending a ridiculous amount of time looking for the perfect head of youth development, or clicking around at random on different countries and leagues and teams, trying to learn as much as you can about the virtual world that you're managing in, or spending far too much time messing around in the data center trying to figure out a way to get an edge on your next opponent. Now, of course, for any of this to be useful, it has to, work. And as many of you already know, one of the biggest problems with the FM26 user interface when the game was published like 2 days ago is that it didn't work. Even after the post-release patch, which I was just playing, the UI is still filled with bugs. I'll show you a couple examples. For example, in older versions of Football Manager, it's easy to look at the youth intake for every single club in your save. You can add these players to your shortlist, offer them a trial, or even scout them right away. Of course, in this save, I can't scout them because I have no scouts, but you get the idea. Now, you can find the same list in FM26. It's there, even though it's not quite easy to find. You have to remember to click on this transfers tile. It's a pain, but whatever. But look at this. You can't right-click on anything. You can click on players individually and do stuff there, but you can't select more than one at a time, which is a huge problem. As many of you know, you can look at the training schedule for your youth and reserve teams. However, you can't change their schedules at all. You also cannot schedule friendlies for them. And the friendly scheduler for your first team is horrible. You can't see anything. Compare that with the one for FM24. Okay, so are these bugs, changes, whatever you want to call them, is this the end of the world? Probably not. But those bugs and the bizarre changes are important because they really do impact immersion. So the thing is that all the menus and the spreadsheets in the game are really designed, or should be designed, to make you feel like you're actually part of this imaginary Football Manager world. And now that has been a key part of the series since the very beginning. The original Championship Manager had music, sure, but its in-match experience really wasn't all that fantastic. The thing that made this game a success was the sandbox nature of the game itself. You literally can do anything you want in your world so long as the board agrees and you have the resources to do it. In fact, if you go way back and you play the first Championship Manager game, you'll notice something surprising. There's no email inbox. Anybody who's tried a modern Football Manager game is familiar with the inbox. In fact, it actually starts to feel annoying after a while. But there was no inbox way back in the beginning. The original Championship Manager simply presents news to you like this with no message to click through. Of course, messages like these are how the game presents the narrative to you. Now, notice that there is a narrative to the Championship Manager game, even without an inbox to tell you what you should care about and what you should do. And actually, that approach is something that we see in a lot of other sports sims. So some of these older games, like the old Appa Baseball for DOS game, barely have a user interface at all. You just get to the game right away and just start playing. Slightly more modern games like Diamond Mine Baseball are kind of similar. The narrative structure to this game is basically entirely dependent on the user's imagination. And oddly enough, games that look really dated like Cactus Professional Basketball for DOS are still quite playable today. Even with their quirks, these games are still immersive provided that you're willing to use your imagination a bit. Now, I really think that this is a point that upper management at Sports Interactive does not understand. So things like in-game graphics do help with immersion, sure, but you really don't need to create a strict and really complicated list of chores for the player to accomplish so that they can feel immersed in the game. In fact, if you trace the Football Manager series over the years, what you'll realize is that Sports Interactive's focus has increasingly been away from improving the match engine and towards making more chores for the players to do. The best example is this screen right here, the tactic creation screen. Now, it's cool to be able to make in and out of possession tactics in FM26, sure, but in the end, the things you're prompted to change and tinker with are not well explained and they make very little sense. And the problem is that you literally cannot continue the game without creating a tactic first, even if you're brand new to the game. So guess what? Hey Miles, you want to know why you've got millions of people who don't play the game for 5 hours? Well, maybe you shouldn't force them to make a tactic before they know what they're doing. I would bet a good percentage of those players don't actually know the first thing about the sport. Now, if you go back to the first Championship Manager, you'll see that tactics have come a long way. I had to assign players to certain numbers on this screen without even looking at the tactic. Now, I probably could have clicked on this tact button here to figure that out, but I didn't. Now, there is a tactical editor, which I learned after one of my players was injured early in the match. But still, if you're not closely familiar with the sport, it would be really hard to figure out what any of this means. So I guess, as confusing and as bad as FM26 has been, at least it is better than Championship Manager in some respects. But the problem is that the follow-ups to Championship Manager were a lot more user-friendly. For example, in Championship Manager 4, your team defaults to a 4-4-2, assuming that you don't change anything. I went and changed a few things, of course, but it's interesting to know that you can just jump right in if you want. In fact, as you can see here, I didn't receive any messages other than the friendly proposal being accepted and the welcome message. And then I went straight to making selections for the match. It was like this for years, too. I mean, this is Football Manager 2006, for example, and you can see that there's a default tactic loaded just in case I don't want to do anything. And once again, you can see that I'm not getting a ton of annoying emails in my inbox trying to get me to do this chore or that chore. Okay, I know that you can turn some of the chores off, but seriously, the game is way too focused on the inbox and on telling you what you need to do. Every new version of Football Manager has included like some sort of task that supposedly is supposed to help us increase immersion, but it just gives you more chores. Plus, why does it have to be an inbox? Why can't I just have parts of the menu light up when I have to do something? I mean, I have to deal with tons of email in my professional and personal life as it is. Can't I get away from email in the game that I really want to play? Other games have a similar structure like Out of the Park Baseball. However, Out of the Park is a lot more generous in letting you adjust settings to get rid of unwanted email. The in-game graphics might not be anywhere as good as Football Manager, but at least you won't be bombarded with messages while you play. Now, I've been tiptoeing here around what the real issue is. It's one of those things that has a lot of the so-called hardcore Football Manager players really upset. That is the contrast between the narrative-based approach and the Sandbox approach. It's obvious that Sports Interactive is pushing in a narrative direction, especially with all the questions that you're asked when you create your manager. This is very similar to the sort of thing you'd experience in a good role-playing game. And I honestly think it's a good fit. After all, Football Manager is an RPG at its core. But can't we have that kind of character-based structure while having the freedom to explore the gaming world? I don't understand why so many basic things were removed, like the ability to scout players directly from the youth intake screen. A game like this should never present the user with information without creating some sort of interaction. Now you see, this is the thing that the so-called hardcore Football Manager gamers really understand. So if your sport's interactive, you really have to help the user create their own immersion and their own narrative. You have to help them flesh this out, but you can't force it on them. In fact, if you look through the history of the sport, you'll notice that there's a lot of narrative happening on and things that are so immersive that people start to have a real emotional connection with what's happening on the pitch. Notice that a lot of this happens naturally because of the circumstances that are created. It's not because some corporation decided that it would be more profitable to do things this way. So for example, England was having a hard time qualifying for the World Cup back in 1973, especially after Bobby Moore made this big mistake to give Poland a goal. When the two teams met at Wembley for a World Cup qualifier, England simply had to win. England came up with an all-out attack. Now, this defensive mistake by England was going to be dramatic no matter what, but the narrative makes it even more interesting, especially in the historical context. And this helps explain why Roy McFarlane committed one of the most ridiculous tackles I've ever seen. Now, I'll tell you what, if you're interested in historic matches or just in historic documents or in whatever, I really recommend you go check out my Patreon. Well, I've got tons of matches like this and want to make them available to the public. I've also got a bunch of assorted Football Manager and Championship Manager files that I've accumulated over the years, some of which might be hard to find. Anyway, check out the link in the description. Anyway, so what would narrative creation look like in Football Manager if it were ideal? Well, it's pretty simple. Ideally, you would have a basic user interface, one that would be inviting to new players, one in which would be pretty easy to get, to the in-match experience of the game itself. But then you would also make it more rewarding for the players who decide to poke around a lot instead of going straight to the next match. For example, in FM17, I'm given a pretty basic screen with only a few emails to look at and no tasks. When I go check out my tactics screen, the game kindly tells me that I probably should look at my players first. Of course, if I'm a power user, I can still push ahead and load the 4-3-1-2 game breaker tactic and just go wild. In Football Manager 2006, I can push ahead and continue without looking into anything else if I really want. Or I can go poke around the entire world and see if there are any players worth signing. It's really easy to navigate. And the more that I dig, the more interesting and somewhat useful information I come across. Plus, as you can see, the screens are designed to give me all the useful information I need at once, and they are all customizable. Now, to be fair, FM26 does have customizable views to a certain extent, but it depends on which screen you're on, it depends on what they decide to open up and what they decided not to. I mean, it really is a mess. Now, I know that the team is working to try to fix all of the stuff that was dead on arrival, but one of the real frustrations with FM26 is the ridiculous way in which screen space is used. So, of course, you can still set things up so that your squad screen shows you the attributes you really need to see. And now I have an idea of which players I want to sell. On the other hand, when it comes to important screens like this tactics screen, there simply is no room to see anything. And even after all the updates, this filter box is still broken and it's really frustrating to use. In contrast, here's the tactics screen in Football Manager 2024, and this is using a skin that takes up a lot more screen space than the default one. Look at all the room I have to add in columns and other things. Going back to this in FM26 is really a negative experience. And the really crazy thing about this is that even some of the small things that would normally help create immersion for the user are done completely wrong. And I mean, some of this stuff is just basic. So check this out. One of my new scouts recommended that we sign this player. I know nothing about him and I can't figure out anything about him from this absolutely empty scouting report screen. It turns out that the guy is 34 years old, which means that I have no interest in him whatsoever. But you couldn't tell me that on this screen? I mean, you couldn't even tell me what position he plays? And why is there a coding error up here where his name is supposed to be? While breezing through useless emails, I came across one that I thought might be interesting for my save. But look at how awful the formatting is here. I can't figure out what Michael Wimmer said without actually clicking in. And when I do click in, it's a disappointment. He didn't really say anything at all. Ah, yes, the joys of Football Manager press conferences and press reports. Anyway, I could probably do this for hours if you wanted me to. FM26 manages to do all of the small things the wrong way, even after the patches and the updates. And it's really hard to get immersed into a game that is fundamentally broken like this. However, it is true that the in-match graphics are nice. But even then, I'm honestly not convinced that FM26 looks better than the 3D mode in FM2017, which should be shocking to you. And FM 2017 also seems to have more interesting and instructive camera angles. In FM 26, there are really only like 3 camera angles, and they still look pretty much the same. But you know, that's a complaint for another day. Now, Sports Interactive's user interface problem isn't just that it's broken, which it is, and which it will probably remain until FM27 or even later. Now, you know, the problem is that it feels like the user interface is actually fighting against what you're trying to do. It's unacceptable for this interface to be this bad after a 2-year wait. And like I showed you, it's even worse when you realize that things were better 20 years ago or even 10 years ago.